Husband abandons his pregnant wife on the mountain, but his dog does the impossible. Madison had no tears left when the sun beat down hard on the mountain rocks. She had cried so much that morning that her eyes burned as if rubbed with sand. Her enormous belly weighed on her tired legs, and the dirt road ahead stretched endlessly, dry, dusty, and with not a single patch of shade to offer rest. It was there, leaning against a stone, scorching with heat, that she watched her husband walk away down the same road they had traveled together 2 years before. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He walked with firm shoulders and long strides, like a man who had made a decision and didn't want to hear anything that might undo it. And Dusty, the grey-coated dog that had been with them since the beginning of their marriage, stood still, staring at the silhouette of his owner as it disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he turned his muzzle toward Madison, walked over to her, and rested his heavy head on her shoulder. She hugged the animal without a word, squeezing her eyes shut so she wouldn't see the point on the road where Tyler had vanished for good. No one there yet knew what had happened inside that marriage to bring everything to this point. The truth was bigger and more twisted than anyone could imagine from the outside, and it would take weeks to come fully to light, piece by piece, like roots unearthed from the ground by a storm. Madison had arrived in that community nestled in the rural hill country a little over 2 years ago, following Tyler, who promised that the land inherited from an uncle would be the start of a new life for the two of them. She left the city where she was born, left behind her mother, her friends, her familiar routine, and she went because she believed, not because she was naive. Madison was anything but naive. But she loved that man with a stubbornness that sometimes she herself couldn't explain. In the first few months, life in the community was hard but bearable. The land Tyler had inherited from Uncle Walter was good. Not big, but enough to plant and get some return. He talked about building, expanding, one day having a goat herd that would supply the surrounding areas. Madison worked alongside him, learned from the women in the community how to handle the dry land of the scrubland, how to harvest without wasting, how to preserve what they planted. She adapted with a grit that impressed even the most skeptical. It was at the beginning of the second year that the cracks began to show. At first, they were small things. Tyler coming home later, answering harshly when she asked something, disappearing on Saturday mornings without explanation. Then came the long silences, the quick, tense arguments that went nowhere, the averted gazes. Madison sensed that a secret was growing between them, but every time she tried to get close, he shut down like a door in the wind. When she found out she was pregnant in the middle of that second year, she waited for the right moment to tell him. She chose a calm night after dinner, with the full moon shining through the kitchen window. Tyler listened to the news in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't hug her. He stared at the table for a long time before saying, in a low voice, that this complicated everything. She didn't understand. She asked what he meant by that. He got up from the table and went to the bedroom without answering. That night was the first time Madison went to sleep, knowing for sure that something was very wrong, something much bigger than she could see. And Dusty, who usually slept at the entrance of the house, that night went to her room and lay down on the floor beside the bed, as if he knew she needed company. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the months that followed, the pregnancy progressed while the marriage fell apart in slow motion. Tyler was present and almost gentle one moment, then gone for days and returned with vague explanations about business he needed to handle. Madison tried to talk, tried to get closer, tried to understand. But there was a wall between them that she couldn't name, and hitting that wall only bruised her fists. One afternoon, Tyler came home with a man she had never seen before. It was Gregory Miller, a middle-aged guy with dark hair combed to the side, wearing an open-collared dress shirt and smiling with an excess of friendliness that bothered Madison from the very first second. Gregory greeted her with a familiarity that didn't match the fact they were meeting for the first time. Complimented the house, complimented the view from the window, said that Tyler's land was some of the best in that area. "That's nice that you think so," said Madison with no warmth in her voice. Tyler looked at her quickly, with a signal in his eyes that she read as a warning. Gregory opened a leather briefcase he had under his arm and took out some papers. He said it was a land regularization agreement, bureaucracy to ensure Tyler's property was properly registered with the right authorities. He spoke with complicated terms, slowly, like someone explaining a simple thing to someone who doesn't understand anything. Madison didn't like the tone, but she also didn't understand the terms. Tyler told her to sign, that everything was fine, that it was just a formality. "I want to read it first," she said. "Madison, it's just a regularization. There's nothing special in there," Tyler replied, with a tension in his voice that she recognized. Gregory smiled again. "You can read it, of course, but it's a lot of technical stuff, a lot of legal language. Let me summarize what matters." And he summarized it. But the summary he gave wasn't what was written in the papers. Madison felt an unease she couldn't turn into an argument. It was something in the way he spoke, something she couldn't put her finger on. Tyler stood beside her, firm, waiting. She signed. Gregory folded the papers carefully and put them back in the briefcase with a smile that this time didn't come anywhere near his eyes. Only much later, when the truth began to come to light, would Madison understand that that signature had given a significant portion of the land to Gregory, not as a formality, but as payment for a debt Tyler had accumulated over more than a year without her knowing anything. The fight that led to the end happened in the early morning hours, weeks before the delivery. Madison had accidentally found, in a pocket of a pair of Tyler's pants she was about to wash, a payment receipt in Gregory's name with amounts she couldn't explain. She saved the paper and waited for her husband to sleep to examine it calmly. Then she went to the drawer where they kept the house documents and looked for the agreement she had signed months before. She didn't find her copy because she had never received one. Early in the morning, with her heart beating fast, she confronted Tyler. She told him what she had found, asked about the receipt, about the documents, about Gregory. Tyler was silent for a moment that seemed to last too long. Then he said she shouldn't have gone through his things. He said there were old debts, that he was handling them, that she didn't need to know everything. "I don't need to know?" Madison's voice came out low, almost more frightening than if she had screamed. "I signed a paper I didn't read, Tyler. I signed because you asked me to." "What's written on that paper?" Tyler stood up from the table. He said he wasn't going to answer questions inside his own house. She said the house was as much hers as it was his. He said she didn't understand how things worked. She said she understood very well that there was something he didn't want her to know. The argument grew, twisted back on itself, and went to places the two of them had never been. Words you can't take back. Things that hang in the air even after the voice falls silent. And in the end, when the sun was already high, Tyler said he needed air, that he was going out to think. But he didn't go alone. He left with the bag he had packed the night before, which Madison only noticed afterward, and walked down the dirt road while she stood in front of the house, huge with child, her hands trembling and her eyes burning. Dusty went to the door, looked in the direction his owner had gone, came back to Madison and stayed. She stood there for a time she couldn't measure. Then she started walking down the road too, not to follow Tyler, but because her legs needed to move, because standing still in front of that house with that empty bag in the bedroom was more than she could handle in that moment. She walked slowly, with Dusty by her side, until her legs gave out, and she sat down, leaning against a large rock at the edge of the road, her belly heavy in her lap, and tears streaming down without her trying to hold them back. That's how Mrs. Martha found her. Martha Jenkins was 71 years old, with white hair tied in a thin braid and dark eyes that missed nothing. She lived in the second house after the entrance to the community and had a habit of walking early in the morning before the heat became unbearable. That morning, as she turned the corner of the road with her empty can that she was going to fill at the community well, she saw Madison leaning against the rock with the dog beside her and stopped immediately. Martha didn't ask questions. She didn't ask what had happened or call anyone. She just put the can on the ground, went over to Madison, gently pulled her arm and said in a voice that brooked no refusal that she was coming inside. Inside where? Madison asked, looking at her with those swollen, tear-filled eyes. My house. Where else? Martha replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Dusty got up and followed them without needing to be called. Mrs. Martha's house was small but very well kept. A cement floor she swept twice a day, a row of plant pots on the living room windowsill, the smell of coffee that lingered in the air from morning until night. She made Madison sit in the deepest chair she had, placed a mug of tea in front of her, and stayed silent while she heated a pot of broth she had saved from the day before. Madison drank the broth without saying a word. Dusty lay down under her chair, and Mrs. Martha sat on the other side of the table, hands folded, with those dark eyes that waited patiently. Only late in the afternoon did Madison begin to talk. She didn't tell everything at once. It came out in pieces, without order, like someone throwing up after holding it in too long. The argument, the papers, Gregory, the debt she didn't know about, the months of silence, the pregnancy that wasn't met with joy. Martha listened to it all without interrupting, without shaking her head in judgment, without letting out a comment in the middle. When Madison finished, she looked at the old woman with a mix of exhaustion and shame, as if expecting an "I told you so" or a "How did you not see this before?" Martha just said, "You'll stay here as many days as you need." And that was it. At night, Madison tried to sleep in the room Martha had prepared for her. A single bed with clean sheets that smelled of soap, a small window with a view of the rural hill country. Dusty stayed outside the room, but she heard his footsteps in the hallway a couple of times, as if he was checking that everything was okay. In the early hours when the house was in total silence, Madison sobbed with a force that came from deep in her chest, that kind of crying that has no more tears, just the spasms of a body that doesn't know what else to do with so much pain. She hugged her belly with both hands, felt the baby move inside her in response, and stayed like that for a while, breathing deeply, trying to convince herself there was still a reason to keep going. Outside the room, Dusty was scratching softly at the door. She opened it. He came in, climbed onto the edge of the bed with a care that seemed rehearsed, rested his heavy chin on the edge of the mattress, and looked at her with those big, yellowish eyes. "You're the only one who didn't leave," she said in a voice so low it barely came out. The dog slowly closed his eyes, as if confirming. The next day the news spread through the community with that speed that only happens in small places, where stories travel faster than people. Some women went to Martha's house with supplies and the pretense of having coffee, but really they went to see for themselves, to gauge the size of the situation, to calibrate what they felt about it. One brought corn grits, another eggs, a third arrived with a bunch of bananas, and felt awkward when she didn't know what to say upon seeing Madison sitting there, with a huge belly and swollen eyes, holding the mug of tea with both hands as if clinging to something. The reactions were as varied as they always are when a difficult story lands in the middle of a community. Mrs. Beatrice, the shopkeeper who had a small grocery store at the entrance to the community, said right away that she always knew Tyler had something hidden. She spoke with that certainty that only exists in those who knew nothing but prefer to pretend they did. Her husband, Harold, snorted through his nose and said that a man who abandons a pregnant woman doesn't deserve land or a roof. Young Lauren, 28 years old, who lived with her husband and 2 small children in the house next to the shopkeeper, looked at Madison with a thoughtful silence that said more than any words. And there were also the whispers in the corners, which Madison pretended not to hear but did hear. She must have done something. A man doesn't leave home for no reason. I don't know her well enough to have an opinion, but the kind of judgment that dresses itself in caution so as not to seem cruel. Martha listened to these whispers with the patience of someone who has seen it all, and when someone dared to say one of those things near her, she responded with a brevity that cut through. No woman with a belly deserves to be left on a roadside rock. You don't need to know anything more than that. And the matter was closed. 3 days after the scene on the road, Tyler showed up in the community. But he didn't go to Martha's house. He went straight to the lot. He opened the rusty gate that creaked loud enough to wake the neighbors and started pulling out from the shed the belongings that were still stored there. Boxes, tools, a roll of wire. some pieces of furniture that had belonged to him before the marriage. The community watched from a distance, each one through a crack in the window or the gate, without getting close. Dusty, who was outside Martha's house, sniffed the air in the direction of the shed. He recognized the owner. He barked once, firmly, and then sat down in front of the old woman's door as if on guard duty. It was Martha who crossed the street. She walked to the lot's gate with that upright posture that women who work hard never lose even in old age, and stood still at the entrance while Tyler piled things onto a handcart. "Tyler," she said, in that voice that doesn't shout but carries far. He stopped, looked at her, and for a second the weight of what he had done crossed his face like a cloud. Then his face closed up again. "Mrs. Martha," he greeted, his voice dry. "What do you plan to do with this land?" He looked away toward the shed before answering. "There are things to sort out. The lot is going to be sold. And Madison and the child that's coming." Tyler was silent for far too long. Then she said, without looking at her, "She knows what she did." Martha was quiet for a moment. That response wasn't what she expected. "She knows what she did," as if there was some guilt on Madison's part that justified all of it. The old woman went back home with that phrase spinning in her head. That night, when Madison was sitting on the porch staring at the dark rural hill country with Dusty beside her, Martha asked directly, "What did Tyler mean by you know what you did?" Madison stayed silent long enough for Martha to know that an answer existed, but that it would take effort to come out. "There's something I haven't told you yet," Madison finally said. And then the story got bigger. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Months before all of that situation, on an afternoon when Tyler was away and Madison was resting inside the house, Gregory Miller had shown up alone at the door with a new batch of papers. He said he needed a confirmation of the previous signature, that there was an error in some data, a document number that needed to be fixed, some bureaucracy. He spoke fast with that same smile of over-the-top friendliness that was unsettling. Madison wasn't feeling well that day. Her blood pressure had gone up a bit, she had a headache, and the heat of that afternoon was suffocating. She told Gregory to wait for Tyler to get back. He insisted it would only take a minute, that Tyler was already aware, that it was really just a data correction. She looked at the papers. They were dense, full of technical language. She asked to read them. Gregory pointed with his finger at the parts he said mattered, skipping others, talking over entire paragraphs. In the end, she signed on a spot he indicated. What she didn't know was that that second document wasn't a correction. It was a supplement, and that the combination of the two papers together gave Gregory rights to half of Tyler's land as payment for a debt of almost 2 years. Did Tyler know about this second document? Madison wasn't sure. Sometimes she thought he did, that he had arranged it all, and that hurt her in a way she couldn't describe. Other times she thought Gregory had acted on his own, taking advantage of the situation, and that uncertainty was almost worse than the pain of being used. When she finished telling the story, Martha stayed silent for a long while. The crickets filled the night outside. Dusty stirred under her chair. "Do you have a copy of any of these documents?" the old woman asked. "No. I never got a copy of anything." Martha took a deep breath. "This could be important," she said, "or it could be a problem. I need to think." But Martha wasn't the kind of woman to just sit and think. The next day, she went to Mrs. Beatrice's general store and stayed there for nearly an hour in a conversation that started as small talk but narrowed down to the matter at hand. Beatrice was the type who saw everything and never forgot anything. She was the community's walking memory. And as they talked, Beatrice remembered a detail she had seen that afternoon when Gregory showed up at Madison's house. "I was sweeping the sidewalk," Beatrice said, in that voice of someone about to deliver important information. "I saw him go in alone, I saw him come out, and I noticed he left with the papers folded differently than when he went in. More papers, you know, like he'd gotten something extra inside the folder." Martha stared at her friend. "Would you be willing to sign a statement saying that?" Beatrice crossed her arms for a second, weighing it. Then she said, If it helps Madison, yes. That same week, Gregory showed up in the community, accompanied by a man who introduced himself as a representative of a buyer interested in the land. There were two strangers walking through the community with a quiet arrogance that was unsettling. They looked at the houses, at the land, at the paths, like someone taking inventory of what belongs to them. They arrived at the gate of Tyler's lot with a notebook and stood there for nearly half an hour, discussing in low voices. Madison saw them from the window of Martha's house. She felt her stomach tighten with a force that went beyond physical discomfort. It was her land they were inventorying, land she had helped work, that she had soaked with the sweat of 2 years of hard labor, that she knew every inch of, where the soil was more humid, where the plants took better, where the sun hit earlier. That afternoon, for the first time since she had arrived at Martha's house, Madison felt sadness turn into something else. Not anger exactly. It was something firmer than anger. It was determination. "I need to fight for that land," she said to Martha, when the two were alone. The older woman didn't answer right away. She looked at the younger neighbor for a moment with those dark eyes that assessed carefully. "Then you're going to need help," Martha replied, "and I know who from." The man Martha had in mind was Arthur Sterling, a lawyer from a neighboring town who was a cousin of a community resident, a woman named Natalie Sterling who worked as a seamstress and had the loudest voice in the area. Martha went to Natalie the next day and asked her to get in touch with her cousin. Natalie, who already knew all about the situation because Beatrice had told her, and Beatrice told everyone everything, called her cousin right away. Arthur was a man of about 55, with grey hair, thick-rimmed glasses, who wore the same suit on formal occasions and open sandals on informal ones. He came to the community on a Thursday afternoon in a white pickup truck that kicked up dust as it stopped in front of Martha's house. He greeted the women, accepted a coffee, sat at the table and listened to Madison tell him everything with full attention, without interrupting, without taking notes, just listening, with his elbows on the table and fingers interlaced. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "You signed without receiving a copy," he said, more as a confirmation than a question. "Not once." And were there witnesses to the signing? Madison thought. The first time, just Tyler. The second time, I was alone with Gregory. Arthur slowly shook his head. "The law requires witnesses for documents that transfer rights to property. Without witnesses, the document can be challenged. And without a copy given to the signer, there's an irregularity in the process." Madison looked at him with a mix of hope and fear. "But does that mean I can reverse it?" "It means you have an argument," he said carefully. "It's not the same as a guaranteed victory, but it's a path." The path, as Arthur explained over the course of the conversation, was difficult and would take time. And time was what Madison had the least of, both because the baby was due soon and because the buyer Gregory had brought in had already put a deposit on the deal, meaning the sale was in progress. Arthur asked her to sign an authorization so he could investigate the documents and, if possible, request a temporary suspension of the negotiation until the irregularity could be reviewed. Madison signed, this time reading everything line by line without letting anyone pressure her. While the lawyer worked, the pressure from outside increased. Gregory showed up in person at Martha's house on a cloudy morning. He knocked on the door with a forced politeness, asked to speak with Madison, and when she appeared at the door with Dusty at her side, he launched into a prepared speech. How he was sorry about the situation, how he understood she was going through a tough time, how there was a generous offer available for her to accept a cash sum and give up the land without further complications. "How much money?" she asked, her face unreadable. He named a number. Madison stayed silent long enough for him to think she was considering it. Then she said, "That amount doesn't even cover half of what the land is worth, and it doesn't even begin to cover what they did to me." Gregory lost his smile for a second, just a second. Then it returned, colder. "You should think carefully, Madison. Disputes like this take time. And time is something a woman in your condition doesn't have in abundance." Dusty, who had been quiet until then, let out a low growl, a brief sound, but it filled the silence of the porch in a way that made Gregory step back half a step, without realizing he had done so. Madison looked at the dog. Then she looked at Gregory. "Thanks for stopping by," she said, and closed the door. Inside the house, she leaned her back against the door and took a deep breath. Her heart was racing. Her hands trembled a little. But there was something different about that tremor. It wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. It was the feeling of someone who had just passed a test and hadn't given in. Mrs. Martha, who had heard everything from the living room, appeared in the hallway with her arms crossed, and a look that, if it had a sound, would have been applause. "Well done," the old woman said, with a brevity that said it all. But the situation was far from resolved. 2 days after the meeting with Gregory, when Madison was resting in the bedroom with Dusty at her feet, Mrs. Martha knocked on the door and came in with a serious expression. "Tyler's here, at the door." Madison opened her eyes. She stayed still for a second, looking at the ceiling. "Does he want to come in?" "He asked to talk to you. Alone." She lay still for another moment. Then she slowly sat up on the edge of the bed, ran her fingers through her hair, breathed. "Let him in," she said. Tyler looked different. You could see it already in the way he stood in the living room when she appeared. His shoulders more slumped, his clothes rumpled like someone who had slept in them. His face carrying that tension of someone who hasn't slept right in days. He looked at her, and she saw beneath all that appearance of a man who knew what he was doing, someone who was scared. Mrs. Martha slipped out silently to the backyard, leaving the two of them alone. Tyler wasn't sure how to start. He stood there for a moment, looked at the dog that had followed Madison into the living room and was now sitting between the two of them like some kind of unwitting referee. Then he sat down in the chair that had belonged to the old woman and crossed his arms over his knees. "I need to tell you something," he said at last. "You should have told me before," she replied, without anger. "Just tiredness." He nodded and stared at the floor. The story Tyler told was bigger and more shameful than what she already knew. The debt to Gregory hadn't started as just any debt. It had begun as a business partnership that went wrong 2 years before they moved to that land. Tyler had invested money in a business reselling agricultural supplies that Gregory had presented as safe and profitable. The business didn't just fail to turn a profit, it sank, and with it went the money Tyler had saved over the years. Instead of telling Madison, he had asked Gregory for a loan, which Gregory agreed to with interest that kept piling up. When the debt reached a level Tyler couldn't pay back in any way, Gregory proposed the solution. The land inherited from the uncle, which had been the reason they moved to that place, would serve as payment. And for the negotiation to be clean, I would need Madison's signature too. She was co-owner of the land through marriage rights. "So you knew what I was signing," said Madison, her voice steady but her eyes hurt. Tyler hesitated. "I knew about the first document," he said after a moment. "But Gregory went there again when I wasn't around, and I didn't know there was a second one. That changes very little, Tyler." "I know," he said, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, he looked directly at her. "I know it doesn't change anything. I messed up. I messed up by not telling you, by letting the debts pile up, by bringing you here promising a life I couldn't guarantee, by being too ashamed to be honest with my wife." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Madison looked at him for a long time. There were so many things she could say, and a year ago she would have said them all. But there, in that moment, with the baby moving inside her and Dusty quiet between them, she only felt the immense weight of everything that had been wasted. "Why did you leave that day?" she asked, her voice smaller. "Why didn't you stay and tell me everything?" Tyler didn't answer right away. He looked at his own hands. "Because I was ashamed of you," he said finally. "More than of anyone else. Because you always did the right thing and I didn't." That answer hurt in a way she wasn't prepared for. Not because of the anger it should have sparked, but because of the sadness it brought. Because inside that confession there was something true, and the truth is sometimes harder to swallow than a lie. "And now?" she asked. "Gregory is pressuring me for more. He said, if I can't get the land sale through, he'll expose things from the time we did business together." Things I don't want anyone to know. Things I don't want you to know. What are those things? Tyler was silent for a moment too long. Business that wasn't honest. I didn't do it, but I was there. I signed things I shouldn't have signed. I turned a blind eye when I shouldn't have. Madison took a deep breath. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier. So he's using that as a threat to secure the sale. Yes. And you were thinking of giving in. I don't know what I was thinking, said Tyler, with an honesty that seemed painful. When I left, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just running. Madison looked out the window for a moment. The hills outside were in the afternoon shadow, that ochre color they take on when the sun no longer hits them head-on. She knew those hills now. She had spent 2 years looking at them. I'm not selling this land, she said, turning her gaze back to him. And you're going to help me keep it. Tyler looked at her with an expression that mixed relief, surprise, and shame, a strange combination to see on a single face. You're going to help me by telling the community leader what Gregory proposed, the offer he made you. You'll tell him everything that the leader can testify, and you'll help Arthur with whatever information he needs. And after that? After that, it's on me, she said with the simplicity of someone who doesn't need to dramatize what they're saying. You'll leave this room and sleep wherever you want, but the land stays. Tyler nodded. Dusty, who had been quiet throughout the whole conversation, got up, walked over to Madison and sat down beside her, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to do it. That same week, the situation began to move in several directions at once, and each of those directions brought with it another knot to untie. Arthur had managed, through contacts he had at a notary's office in a neighboring town, to confirm that the 2 documents weren't fully valid because the signatory hadn't received a copy, and there had been no independent witnesses present at the time of the second signature. He prepared a formal notice that would be sent to the buyer Gregory had brought in, warning that the deal was under dispute and that any further steps could later be annulled. The buyer, upon receiving the notice, contacted Gregory on his own and said he didn't want to get involved in a legal battle. He had the money, but didn't want the headache. He informed that he was withdrawing the offer until the situation was resolved. Gregory was left without the buyer and without the deposit he had received, because the agreement with the buyer stipulated a refund if the sale didn't go through. The news reached the community in fragments, through twisted channels, because Gregory wasn't the type of man to announce his defeats. But Mrs. Beatrice, who had an ear for these things, heard from her nephew who had heard from someone who had seen the buyer's man leaving Gregory's house with the same briefcase he had arrived with, which meant he left without signing anything. Mrs. Beatrice told Martha. Martha told Madison cautiously, without blowing the victory out of proportion. "This isn't over," said the old woman. "He'll try another way." And he did. Gregory sought out Tyler once more, on an afternoon when he was on the property, checking what was left after moving the belongings. This time he offered a different split. If Tyler helped convince Madison, Gregory would split the sale value with him and help make the evidence of the old dealings disappear. It was a proposal disguised as a deal, but it was, in essence, an attempt to buy a husband's betrayal of his wife. Tyler listened, and this time, for the first time in a long while, he didn't waver. He went to the community leader, a man about 60 years old named Bernard, who had been handling the collective matters of the neighborhood for over a decade. Tyler told everything Gregory had proposed, without omitting anything, without sparing himself in the parts where he himself had been wrong. Bernard listened with the seriousness of someone who carries years of things he has seen and hasn't forgotten on his face. In the end, he said he would write down what he had heard and sign his name underneath. He also said it wasn't the first time he had seen this kind of scheme, someone from outside showing up, making promises, using papers to take what belonged to those who didn't know the law. "It happened to Raimundo's family years ago," said Bernard, looking at Tyler with a look that was both understanding and a warning. "The community won't let it happen again." With Bernard's statement, Mrs. Beatrice's declaration, the signatures of Natalie Sterling and 2 other women who had witnessed the state of vulnerability in which Madison had been approached, and the information Tyler provided to Arthur about the full history of the debt, the lawyer put together a set of documents that made the challenge to the signatures much stronger than a simple technical irregularity. Arthur came personally to the community to deliver to Madison a summary of what had been built. He sat at Martha's table, placed the papers in front of her, and began explaining each point, each argument, each detail working in her favor. Madison listened carefully, asking questions when she didn't understand, taking notes in a little notebook with a blue cover she had found in the table drawer. It was the same Madison who had arrived in that community 2 years earlier, determined, curious, refusing to accept less than what she understood. Only this time there was a difference. She was no longer alone, and she knew it. When Arthur finished explaining, she asked, "What are the real chances of me keeping the land?" The lawyer took off his glasses and cleaned them with the hem of his shirt before answering, a gesture she had learned to recognize as his way of organizing what he was about to say. "Good," he said. "I can't guarantee it, because a lawsuit isn't a sure thing. But good." She nodded. "Then we keep going." But before any resolution could come, the situation took yet another unexpected turn. One morning, Lauren, the young neighbor who had been watching Madison with that thoughtful silence from the very beginning, knocked on Martha's door earlier than usual. She brought information that had reached her through the daughter of an acquaintance who lived on the same block where Gregory stayed when he came to the community. Gregory had sought out a second lawyer, an outsider from a larger town, and was preparing a counter-notification claiming that Madison had signed the documents freely and knowingly, and that her husband had agreed to the transaction. The strategy was to use Tyler against her, pointing out that since he was the one who had asked for the signature, any irregularity would be the couple's responsibility, not Gregory's. Madison listened to the information while sitting, with her hands resting on her belly in silence. "He wants to pit me against Tyler," she said slowly. "That's what it looks like," Lauren agreed. "But if Tyler testifies in my favor, that won't work," Madison said, thinking out loud. "Only if Tyler sticks to what he told Bernard." Madison looked up at Lauren. "Can you go to Tyler and tell him I need to talk to him?" Lauren went. Tyler showed up early in the afternoon. This time, he didn't need to be announced. Dusty recognized his footsteps on the sidewalk and stayed quiet without growling, just watching as he came through the door. The conversation between the two was short, but important. Madison explained what she had learned, what Gregory was planning, and what she would need from Tyler. He listened to it all with the same serious expression of someone tallying up the damage he had caused. "I'll stick to what I said," he replied when she finished. "Even if Gregory uses those old stories against you." Tyler was silent for a moment. "I've already thought about that," he said. "If he exposes them, it'll look bad for me. But what he was trying to do to you is worse. And it's my fault he had a way to try." Madison looked at him for a moment. "I'm not forgiving you, Tyler," she said, with a clarity that wasn't cruel, just honest. "But I am thanking you." He nodded slightly and left. Dusty followed him with his eyes to the door. Then he came back to Madison's side. In the following days, Madison's health began to show signs that the baby was closer than the calendar indicated. The community's midwife, a woman of about 55 named Dorothy, who had attended more births in that region than she could remember, started spending more time at Martha's house. She checked Madison's blood pressure twice a day, made her walk on the porch on the cooler mornings, and prepared teas that helped her sleep better. Dorothy was a woman of few words, but great presence. When she entered a room, people felt calmer without quite understanding why. She and Martha had a friendship spanning decades. They had grown up in the same rural hill country, separated by life, but reunited in that community years ago. "How is she?" Martha asked the midwife one afternoon while Madison was resting. "The baby is fine," Dorothy said, with the precision of someone who distinguishes between the question asked and the answer that needs to be given. "The mother is carrying a weight that's not in her belly." "I know," Martha said. "She's strong." "But even strong can bend, Martha." The old woman nodded and stood looking out the window at the hills. She herself knew well what it was to be strong and to bend. She had lived through that decades ago, in a different story but with the same taste of abandonment. Her husband, Robert, had left, not down a dirt road, but into the arms of another woman, when the children were still small. Martha had been left with 4 kids, a house that needed repairs and a piece of land she didn't know how to work alone. But she learned. And the children grew up, and the land bore fruit, and Robert became a story she told rarely and without bitterness, because the bitterness had over the years transformed into a wisdom she carried like a useful tool. It was that story Martha told Madison one night when the two of them were alone on the porch, with the smell of wet earth that the fine rain had brought. Madison listened in silence, looking at the old woman with those deep eyes that processed everything slowly. "You stayed?" she asked when Martha finished. "I stayed," said the old woman. "And I don't regret it." "Didn't you feel like you had lost?" "I felt like I had gained," said Martha, with that brevity she used for the most important things. "Because I found out I could support myself on my own. That's something no one can take away afterward." Madison was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I want to stay too." "I know," said Martha. "Not because I have nowhere to go, I do. My mother is there, I have my city. But I want to stay because this land is mine, and because I haven't moved from here into myself yet." The old woman looked at her with a look that held approval, affection, and a hint of something that seemed almost like pride. That kind of pride you feel for someone who isn't blood, but is family in a way that needs no explanation. "Then stay," she said. The fine rain continued for a while longer, and the two of them sat in silence on the porch, listening to its sound on the roof tiles, with Dusty lying between their chairs as if he were the common denominator of it all. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now, continuing, Gregory Miller's counter-notification arrived in writing to Arthur Sterling at the beginning of the following week. It was exactly what Lauren had anticipated, an attempt to hold the couple responsible for the irregularity, presenting Tyler as the main agent of the transaction and Madison as a knowing and consenting party. Arthur read it carefully, took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and called Natalie Sterling saying he needed to talk to Madison. When he arrived at the community, he sat at Martha's table again and cut straight to the point. They're trying to use the fact that it was Tyler who asked for the signature to claim that he and you were acting together and in agreement. The argument is that being married, the decision was the couple's. "But I didn't know about the debt," said Madison. "Exactly. And that's the key point. We need to prove that you had no knowledge of the true nature of the documents, that you signed believing one thing while something else was being done." "How do we prove that?" Arthur looked at her. "Tyler will have to formally declare that you weren't informed, that the information was deliberately withheld. It doesn't help him, but it's the truth. He already said he'll stick with what he told me." "There's something else," said the lawyer. "You mentioned that Gregory went to your house while Tyler was away. You said Dusty was present when Gregory arrived. It seems irrelevant, but there's a detail. You had said before that Dusty always barked at strangers. If the dog stayed quiet when Gregory arrived, it means it wasn't the first time he came, which contradicts the narrative that it was a simple, unexpected visit. The animal already knew him from other visits that Tyler hadn't mentioned to you." Madison was silent, processing. "This shows that Gregory's visits were more frequent than Tyler initially admitted," Arthur continued, "which reinforces that there was a prior, planned relationship between the two that was deliberately hidden from you. It was a small detail that suddenly became big." Madison looked at Dusty, who was lying in the corner of the living room with his head on his paws, eyes half closed. "The dog as a witness," she said, with an involuntary smile that was the first genuine, light-hearted one she'd let out in weeks. Arthur smiled too, that controlled lawyer's smile that doesn't give much away. "Not exactly, but the animal's behavior is supporting evidence, a detail that shows consistency in their story and inconsistency in theirs. Tyler, when called to formally testify before Arthur, confirmed everything. He confirmed Gregory's visits that he hadn't told Madison about. He confirmed that he had asked her to sign without explaining what was actually being signed. He confirmed the origin of the debt, the nature of the business deal that had gone wrong, the promises Gregory had made and failed to keep. Everything, No omissions, no sanitized version. Arthur turned all of that into documentation. He combined it with the statements from Mrs. Beatrice Bernard, Natalie Sterling, and the other women. He prepared a response to Gregory's counter-notification that dismantled the main argument, that Madison had acted as a knowing party, by showing that the omission had been deliberate, systematic, and documented. When Gregory received the response, he learned that there was no buyer available anymore, that the irregular documentation was being challenged with solid arguments, and that the husband had testified in favor of the wife. His outside lawyer, after assessing the new situation, informed him that the cost of a prolonged dispute would be greater than any gain Gregory could still get from the deal. Gregory no longer showed up in the community. The buyer who had put down a deposit on the deal contacted Gregory to get the money back. Gregory, with no choice, returned it. The sale was officially called off due to lack of conditions to proceed. The land stayed. Arthur came in person to tell Madison the outcome. She was on the porch when he arrived, sitting with her bare feet on the cool cement floor, Dusty lying beside the chair. She stood up slowly. Her belly was huge, every movement required effort, and got to her feet to listen. When he finished explaining, she was silent for a moment. "Is it over?" she asked. "This part is over," he said, with the caution of someone who doesn't promise more than he can deliver. She nodded. She looked at the hills. She breathed in the dry, hot air of that late afternoon, and then she felt it. Not explosive relief, not euphoria, nothing dramatic. She felt a stillness that was different from the emptiness of the past few months. It was a kind of silence that had substance. Mrs. Martha, who had stepped out without a word while the lawyer was speaking, came back with a tray of coffee and a plate of cookies she had made that morning. She set it down on the porch table, sat in her chair, and looked at Madison with those dark eyes that held decades. "And now?" the old woman asked. "Now I take care of my land," said Madison. Mrs. Martha picked up her coffee mug, blew on it slowly, and said nothing more. But the corner of her lip curled up in a way that was unmistakably a smile. The baby was born in the early hours of a cold Thursday, with a veil of fog settling over the hills, as if the night wanted to cover that moment with something soft. Dorothy had been there since the first hours of the night, when the contractions started coming with a regularity the midwife recognized immediately. Mrs. Martha stayed in the living room, praying in a very low voice without kneeling, because her knees couldn't take it anymore, but her faith could. Dusty stayed in the hallway outside the bedroom, quiet, still, as if he knew something important was happening on the other side of that door, and the best thing he could do was guard the space. The labor lasted over 4 hours. Madison didn't scream, not the way some women scream. She was breathing hard, gritting her teeth, holding Dorothy's hand, and letting out short, quick words that were more breath than language. Dorothy spoke to her the whole time, with that steady voice that neither rises nor falls, guiding without alarming. When the baby's cry tore through the silence of that early morning, Dusty slowly lifted his head in the hallway. He thumped his tail on the floor once, a dull thud on the cement, and stayed put. Inside the room, Dorothy placed the baby in Madison's arms. It was a boy, small, red, with clenched fists and closed eyes, screaming at the world as if he had plenty to say from the very first second. Madison looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she took him with both arms, pressed her face to his tiny forehead and closed her eyes. Mrs. Martha, hearing the cry, slowly opened the hallway door and poked her head in. Dorothy nodded with a smile that said everything was fine. The old woman entered, stood beside the bed looking at the mother and child with an expression that was both tenderness and reverence, the kind of look older people have when they recognize in a moment the continuation of something greater. "What name are you going to give him?" Dorothy asked as she adjusted the baby in his wrappings. Madison thought for a moment. She had thought of names over the months, names she'd saved and discarded. But in that instant, looking at her son who had survived everything inside her, a specific name came to her, not out of reason, but out of recognition. "Benjamin," she said. Dorothy smiled. "Good name." When Madison asked for Dusty to be brought into the room, the midwife raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Mrs. Martha went to the hallway, opened the bedroom door, and the dog entered with a care that seemed rehearsed, slowly looking around, as if he knew he needed to be gentle in that space. He went to the bed, sniffed the baby wrapped in cloths with an almost human caution, nostrils working slowly without roughness, and then went to the foot of the bed and lay down without a sound. Mrs. Martha looked at that image, the exhausted mother with her child in her arms, the serene dog at her feet, and told Mrs. Beatrice later that it was the most beautiful and saddest thing she had ever seen at the same time in her entire life. Beautiful because life was beginning again, right there. Sad because there was so much suffering in the story that led to that moment. And suffering doesn't just disappear because something good happens afterward. Tyler learned of his son's birth still in the early morning through the message Bernard sent him. He showed up at Mrs. Martha's house at dawn, when the sun was still weak and the rural hill country had that purple color that only happens very early. He knocked on the door carefully, like someone who knows he might not be welcome but comes anyway. Mrs. Martha opened it. She looked at him for a second, sizing him up. Then she stepped back and let him in. He stood in the living room for a moment, still, until Madison called from the bedroom. "You can come in, Tyler." He pushed the door open slowly. Madison was sitting on the bed with her son in her arms, damp hair tied in a rushed braid, deep dark circles under her eyes, the expression of someone who is exhausted but entirely present. And in her arms was Benjamin, who had stopped crying and was sleeping with his mouth slightly open and his tiny fingers loose beside his face. Tyler stood in the corner of the room for a moment. He looked at his son with an expression that didn't have an easy name. It was admiration and guilt, and a tenderness that seemed ancient, as if it had existed even before the boy was born. Then he looked at Madison. "May I?" he asked, extending his arms hesitantly. She looked at her son for a second, then she looked at him. "You may," she said. Tyler took the baby with the care of someone who had never held something so small and so important at the same time. She stared at that tiny face with tears welling in her eyes, and Madison saw the exact moment he stopped holding back, the heave of his chest, the breath he caught, and then a silent sob that came out of him without warning. Dusty, who had lifted his head when Tyler walked in, looked at the man for a moment with those yellow eyes that did not judge. Then he put his head back down on his front paws. Madison watched her husband cry with their son in his arms, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that moment wasn't already saying on its own. The magnitude of what had been lost, the weight of what had been wasted, and at the same time the existence of that baby who didn't need to carry any of his father's debts. After a while, Tyler handed Robert back to Madison. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, his voice still hoarse, "I'll help. However you'll let me, I'll help." "I know," she replied, "but it'll take time." "I know that too." He left without another word, and Madison stayed with her son in her arms, looking out the small window at the hills that the fog had not yet fully released. The months that followed Robert's birth were ones of rebuilding, slow, sometimes difficult, but real. Madison went back to the plot as soon as Dorothy gave the okay, 3 weeks after giving birth. She went with Robert in the sling that Martha had improvised from a piece of thick cloth, Dusty walking beside her, and her hands ready to work. The plot had lain fallow throughout that whole situation, and there was much to recover. Weeds everywhere, some fences needing repair. The vegetable garden she had planted before the fight with Tyler was half lost. She started with the garden, not because it was the most urgent part, but because the garden was the thing she had loved most about that plot from the very beginning. It was there that she had learned, in those first months, that she had a knack for the earth, that she knew when to water, when not to, when the plant was asking for sun, and when it was asking for shade. It was a language she had learned without a teacher, just by paying attention. Mrs. Beatrice, upon learning that Madison had gone back to working the plot, began sending her oldest daughter every morning to help for an hour before school. Lauren sometimes showed up in the afternoon, with her small children in tow, and would work while the kids ran around the plot without a care. Bernard sent 2 men from the community to fix the fences free of charge. He said it was neighborly help, with no further explanation. And Martha came every day, not to work the land because her knees and back no longer allowed it, but she would sit in a chair that Madison had left under the mango tree that grew in the corner of the plot, with Robert in her lap humming softly while his mother worked. Sometimes she would watch Madison digging or planting or pruning and stay silent for a long time, with that expression that had no name but which Madison had learned to recognize. It was Martha being happy in a quiet way, the way people who have suffered a lot are happy, without excess, without performance, just being. Tyler kept his promise. He would show up on Saturdays to see Robert and stay as long as Madison said he could. He never tried for more than that. Sometimes he helped with something practical on the plot, a repair, a heavy load, without asking for conversation or space that wasn't offered. There was a distance between them that still hurt, but which also served a purpose. It was the distance that needed to exist so that Madison could discover without rush who she was when she wasn't trying to hold together a marriage that had fallen apart. And she was discovering it. She discovered that there was a security inside her that didn't depend on anyone being by her side. That she could make decisions, solve problems, and talk to people who intimidated her without letting the intimidation overpower her. That she knew how to work the land better than she had supposed. That there was a genuine pleasure in digging the soil and planting something and then watching it turn into food. She also discovered that there were real friendships waiting for her in that community. Not the kind of friendship that exists just because people live nearby, but the kind that forms when someone is truly seen at their worst moment and isn't abandoned. Mrs. Beatrice became a constant presence, loud, direct, sometimes invasive in a way that made Madison laugh instead of getting annoyed. Lauren became the same generation friend she hadn't been able to keep in the city after the move. Dorothy showed up regularly to see Benjamin and sometimes stayed drinking coffee with Martha for hours, the two of them with that complicity of women who know life up close. Natalie Sterling, the loud-voiced seamstress, made a complete layette for the baby without charging a thing. She said it was a gift, and if anyone asked the price, she'd make up some number that wouldn't cover the work, but would preserve both their dignities. And Dusty stayed. He stayed as if he always knew he would stay, as if the decision had been made even before the husband left, and the animal was simply carrying out what he had already decided. He slept at the bedroom entrance when Benjamin slept, stayed close to Madison when she worked, growled at strangers who came with sour faces and wagged his tail at familiar people. He had become a kind of trust gauge. Whoever Dusty welcomed warmly, Madison welcomed warmly. Whoever Dusty ignored, she paid attention to. Arthur Sterling showed up one last time about 2 months after Benjamin was born, with the final documents confirming that the land remained registered in Madison's name. She signed each one calmly and carefully, reading everything without rushing. When she finished, she folded the copy that belonged to her with care and went to store it in a cookie tin she had turned into a document safe on top of the wardrobe, out of anyone's reach. Arthur watched her do this and said nothing. But on his way out, as he was saying goodbye to Martha at the door, he commented quietly, "She learned to sign with awareness." Martha replied just as quietly, "She learned a lot of things." Lauren, who had observed Madison's whole saga up close, began asking questions, not about the land or about Tyler, but about the decisions, how she had chosen to stay, how she had decided to fight, how she had remained firm in the moments when the situation was scariest. Madison answered without romanticizing. She said there was no formula, that there were days she doubted everything and others when she felt certain that what kept her going wasn't courage all the time. It was the refusal to let other people's cowardice become the end of her story. Lauren listened with a silence that Madison had learned to recognize. It was the silence of someone applying what they were hearing to their own life, weighing whether it fit. One afternoon, Lauren arrived at the plot, while Madison was pruning the branches of a passion fruit vine she had planted near the fence, and said, without beating around the bush, "I think my marriage also has problems I've been pretending not to see." Madison stopped what she was doing. She looked at her friend. "Want to talk about it?" "Not today," said Lauren, "but someday." "Whenever you want," said Madison, and went back to the branches. That was enough. There were still things that were hard. There were nights when Madison woke up in the middle of sleep, with that heavy feeling that something was wrong, took a second to remember where she was and what had happened, and then lay awake for a good while with Benjamin sleeping beside her and Dusty quiet on the floor. At those moments, she didn't try to force sleep back. She would pick up the little blue notebook and write, not a diary, not a letter, just loose words that needed to come out to make room for other things inside her. There was also the discomfort of the Sundays when Tyler came and spent some time with his son, and she had to find a way to be in the same space without letting it cost more than she was willing to give. Over time, that got easier, not because the hurt had faded, but because she had learned to put the hurt in its place, not to let it take up more room than it deserved. One Sunday, when Tyler was sitting on the porch with Robert in his arms, the baby was already 4 months old, holding his own head up and looking at everything with that intense curiosity of babies who haven't yet learned to filter what's interesting. Madison came over with 2 glasses of juice and set one in front of him without ceremony. Tyler looked at the glass, then he looked at her. "Thanks," he said, in a voice that carried more weight than the word alone could hold. She nodded and went to sit a little farther away, in the other porch chair. They sat in silence for a while, both watching the baby whose eyes were fixed on the branches of the mango tree swaying in the wind. Dusty was lying between their chairs, in his usual spot as the unwilling referee. It wasn't a blended family, it wasn't a reconciliation, it was something more honest and harder than that. It was 2 adults who had deeply hurt each other, trying to find a way to exist in the same space for the sake of a child who hadn't asked to be born in the middle of all that. And Madison thought it was possible. Not easy, never easy, but possible. Mrs. Martha, who had gone to visit Natalie Sterling that afternoon and came back when the sun was already low, found them on the porch with the baby and the dog, and stood still for a moment before going inside. She looked at that scene from afar, with those dark eyes that had seen so much over 7 decades. Then she went in, passed by them with a nod, went to the kitchen and put the kettle on to heat. Because there was always coffee to make and life to go on, and that was a rhythm she knew well. Madison's vegetable patch started to yield 3 months after she had replanted it from scratch. First came the herbs, green onions, cilantro, basil, which sprout fast and don't ask for much. Then came the tomatoes, the okra, the zucchini. The soil of that plot, which had been the cause of so much argument and so much pain, proved it still had something to give when tended with care. Madison started trading the surplus with neighbors, okra for flour, tomatoes for eggs, basil for soap. The trading became a habit, the habit became a network, and without any planning she became part of a circuit that supplied small needs for several houses in that community. Mrs. Beatrice started selling the herbs in her store with Madison's name on the wrapping paper, Madison's Garden, and that was a small thing that carried a lot of weight, because it meant she had gone from being the woman who arrived abandoned in the middle of nowhere to being someone recognizable and rooted in that place. Madison's mother, who lived in the city where she was born, came to visit her when Robert turned 5 months old. She was a woman in her 60s, with dyed black hair, a loud voice, and a way of walking into a house as if she had always lived there. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, greeted Mrs. Martha with the warmth of someone who had heard a lot about her, picked up her grandson, and walked around the porch with him for half an hour without putting him down. Then she went to the plot with Madison and stood looking at the vegetable patch for a long time. "You did this here," she said, more as a statement than a question. "I did," said Madison. Her mother was silent for a moment. Then she said, in a voice choked with emotion, "When you called me and told me what happened, I wanted to come get you right away. Buy a bus ticket, come here and bring you home." "I know," said Madison. "Why didn't you let me?" Madison looked at the vegetable garden, at the hills in the background, at the land that had survived all that turmoil. "Because I wasn't ready to go. I needed to find out if I could stay." Her mother looked at her for a long time, with that look only mothers have, seeing the adult child but also still seeing the child they once were, the 2 overlapping in one image. "You did it," her mother said finally. "I'm still doing it," Madison corrected with a small smile. "It's different." Her mother stayed for a week. During that time, she learned the names of all the people who had helped her daughter, thanked each one personally, made a huge lunch on Saturday, and invited the whole neighborhood, who came in waves throughout the day. It was a noisy lunch, full of mixed conversations, kids running around the property, Dusty weaving between people's legs, getting treats from hand to hand. Martha sat in a chair with Benjamin on her lap most of the time, and Madison's mother went up to her during a quieter moment of the lunch and sat beside her. "Thank you," Madison's mother said, "for pulling her off the road." Martha glanced at her sideways. "She pulled herself out," the old woman said. "I just offered a chair." Madison's mother was silent for a moment, then she laughed. That kind of laugh that comes along with teary eyes. When her mother left on Sunday, Madison stood at the entrance of the community until the bus's dust settled. Dusty stood beside her, sitting looking in the same direction. After the dust cleared, they both stood still for a moment longer, and then Madison said in a low voice, "Let's get to work." And they went back to the property. Benjamin grew at the rhythm of that place, to the sound of the wind in the hills, the song of the birds that came in the rainy season, the voices of the women who worked and talked and laughed with that naturalness of those who don't separate work from life. He learned to walk on his mother's property, among the planting beds with Dusty always nearby, and grew into that kind of child raised outdoors, attentive, curious, unafraid of getting dirty. Tyler fulfilled the role he had promised, and over time he earned a space that wasn't what it had been before but was honest, the space of a present father within the boundaries his mother had set. There were days when Madison felt the hurt return like a wave, and there were days when the hurt seemed distant and powerless. She learned not to expect either kind of day to last forever, to let both exist without either one dictating the tone of everything. Martha stayed as she had always stayed, present, discreet when needed, and direct when necessary. She aged a bit more, as people age when they keep living, with slower steps but eyes with the same dark sparkle. Benjamin called her Grandma Say-So as soon as he learned to speak, and she didn't correct him. She let the name stand as a gift. The vegetable garden kept growing. The land that had been the cause of so much conflict slowly, without any speeches, became the place where Madison's life had finally put down real roots. Not the roots she had imagined when she arrived there 2 years earlier, following a husband with promises of a beautiful beginning. They were different roots, deeper, harder to pull out, born in the arid soil of a story that had demanded everything she had. And Dusty stayed. He stayed as if he had never considered any other option. He grew old alongside that story, with a whiter snout, slower movements, longer sleep. But she still woke up when she heard a strange noise, still lingered between Madison and anything unfamiliar, still wagged her tail when Benjamin came running and threw himself on top of her with that excessive energy of a child who doesn't know the limits of their own enthusiasm. There was an afternoon, long after all of that, when Madison was sitting under the mango tree after a day of work, with Benjamin sleeping in her lap and Dusty lying at her feet, staring at the rural hill country that turned ochre at that time of day. Martha had gone out to have coffee with Mrs. Beatrice, and there was a good silence on the property. The kind of silence that doesn't weigh you down, that breathes. She thought about the day she had sat on a rock on that same road, with the sun beating on her face and the crying that wouldn't stop, watching Tyler's silhouette disappear around the bend. She thought about how much that moment had seemed like the end of everything, and she was surprised, not for the first time, at how the end of one thing can be the beginning of another that never could have existed any other way. It wasn't a story of easy happiness. There were scars, there were tough nights, there was longing for things that wouldn't come back and hurts that hadn't completely faded, but there was also that, the son sleeping heavily in her lap, the old dog at her feet, the land she had learned to work, the community that had become family, the old woman with dark eyes who had opened the door when she was a stranger, lost on a roadside rock. Dusty slowly lifted his head, as if he had noticed she was thinking. He looked at her with those yellowish eyes that aged without losing their attentiveness. Then he rested his chin back on his front paws. Madison lowered her gaze to her son, to the little hands open in sleep, to the chest rising and falling with that perfect calm that only babies and animals have when they feel safe. She stayed like that for a long while, not wanting that moment to end, and she knew with that quiet certainty that sometimes arrives without warning that she had made the right choice by planting her feet on that dirt road and not leaving. End of the story. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Where are you watching us from? Comment below, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will touch your heart, just like this one.